Hey, it's Ken.
Hi.
Hey, buddy, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good.
Yeah. So how long do you have to speak today?
Hour and a half.
Okay. That's plenty of time. You know, we tossed some issues around
Sure.
via email, and I guess we can just kind of swim around in those one by one until we run out of time or attention.
Okay.
So I kind of figured that maybe the best way to go about this would be to ease into it with a little bit of just discussion about, you know, an analytical discussion on music and how music appears and how we understand it, and then maybe kind of get into a little bit more of a poetic and artful tone in our discussion.
Oh, sure.
That's good with you? All right. Well, then my first, first of all, you're doing well, right?
Yeah, doing fine. Thank you.
Yeah. And you've got a birthday coming up, too.
I do.
Well, happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, cool.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've been talking about with my friends is something that's kind of central to a lot of people's world right now, is the changing role of music in our culture. That this technological revolution that we're going through now, it's a revolution in communication. And so the role of communication is expanding like it tends to in the middle of a technological revolution.
Right.
And so just as someone who's certainly given a lot of thought to what the consequences of new communication and discourse are going to mean in the 21st century, how do you see the role of music expanding or changing in the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years?
Yeah. Well, it depends on how you look at music in terms of its actual functionality, its actual contours, its actual definition. We sort of begin with pointing out that music is an artifact. So it's something that is created meaningfully by human sentient beings. And it has a component of it that can be looked at as just purely expressive, which is something that an artist can, in a sense, theoretically just do alone. But then it also has a communicative aspect. It's something that is meant to be conveyed to another sentient being. And that then opens the artifact to being interpreted in terms of the altitude that it's created at. And this basically then leaves music's self-expressive and communicative capacity coming from a particular altitude. And different types of music, or even within types of music, individuals and different artists in specific types of music can pretty much span almost an entire spectrum. And so what we're looking at is a range of signifiers that are both self-expressive and communicative. And particularly in the communicative mode, it's a system or pattern of signifiers that's going to go through a particular medium, and the medium itself can be an important part of the message, but goes through a particular medium and then is decoded as a signified in a human or group of human beings. And so that essentially means several things in terms of the role of music, what music is doing, and so on. And one is that you can look at the actual content of music, its actual altitude, and whether it's evoking sort of a second to third chakra rock and roll beat, or whether it's more cerebral and Bach classical music, sort of sixth to seventh chakra. And you can look at it in terms of that kind of altitude evoking, and that refers essentially to the structure of music. and the structural altitude that music fits into as a signifier. And again, whether it's aiming at sort of lower chakras or intermediate chakras or higher chakras. But then you can also look at music as its capacity to evoke states of consciousness. And this is probably one of the most important aspects of music as a spiritual transmission, because music at any level can start out as a third-person artifact and then can actually end up as a first-person identification. A person can actually end up feeling one with the art in a non-dual flow state. And if not a flow state, then as a pure witness, a contemplation of the art as being so beautiful or so arresting or so provoking that one is thrust in to a causal witness state. And if that deepens or intensifies, it will go from that third or second person into a first-person identification. And one gets into a flow state. One loses oneself in the art. The art evokes and pulls forth a capacity for causal or non-dual spirit. And this can happen at, again, virtually any altitude, just as states, peak experiences can occur at any altitude. But looking at the state transition itself is one of the really important aspects of art, because at whatever level a society is at, art is one of its primary means of transmitting causal and non-dual spirit. And you had some questions about the environment, and in the modern world, as artists are the primary spiritual speakers, in one way to put it, and that's in a sense that's true. So what we're looking at are two different scales of what art does. One is the altitude that the signifiers of art are flying at. And that's a developmental altitude. It's an altitude of complexity, an altitude that is put into the artwork by the consciousness of its maker, by the artist, and will then tend to evoke the same level in viewers or readers or listeners, the same level of signifies as the level of signifier. And so in the modern, in the coming world, art does two things. One, it has a world of higher signifiers open to it. It has a world of integral or second tier, and in some cases third tier, altitude open that it can resonate from. And whether it's in music or painting or literature, it can transmit that second tier evocation, that integral transmission. And then another is its capacity for state. And in this capacity, as in the past, art has a possibility of evoking state experiences in the viewer, listener, or reader. And these can be subtle states of just emotional intensity, but it can be spiritual states of causal contemplation and non-dual flow. And it was non-dual flow, for example, that Schopenhauer had in mind when he talked about art transmitting spiritual awareness, where subject and object become one in the viewer, and that's a non-dual flow state. So sort of two parts, and that's just an analytical, a third-person answer to the question. There's also first-person answers to the question, which are just more aesthetic responses to what aesthetics is. But that's kind of an overview of a third-person view of where art is, and that it's opening up on a frontier now of a second-tier transmission, as well as being able to transmit and evoke states of consciousness. And those are essentially similar in the past, except that they are going to be interpreted. If somebody comes out of a non-dual flow state and that person happens to be at turquoise, and the art itself was composed by a turquoise mind, then if you ask the person, the listener, hearer, viewer, to explain the artwork, they will explain it from an integral vantage point. They'll explain it from a turquoise vantage point in terms of just the effect it has on them. And whether that's music and it just somehow makes me feel whole, or whether it's literature and there's a consistent writing from a second-tier perspective that's taken and conveyed and evoked in the narrative itself, or whether any sort of art in its communicative form now has signifiers that are available at second tier. And this is a fairly novel breakthrough. And certain great artists of the past have had a chance to push into second tier cognitively and relate that aesthetically. But we're coming to a point now where there are a large number of everyday individuals that are at that. They're advanced everyday individuals, but it's somewhere upwards of 5% of the population. So that adds a mix to art that was not present before. And the last thing I'll say about it is when it comes to art recognized by art critics, we have basically just about run the course of postmodern art, and that's art that has green altitude signifiers and is also heavily invested with normative judgments. So art basically has been politicized, which is not really its function, but that's what green postmodern artists and critics have done with it. But we have about run that course. And so what's new is signifiers coming from integral, signifiers coming from postmodern. And whether that's just in music composed by individuals at second tier and a certain resonance that comes across in that, or whether it's actual narrative forms that convey these second tier perspectives either explicitly by talking about integrative material or implicitly by coming from that altitude. However, that form of the art, it has a capacity to use signifiers, and it is going to start using signifiers that are postmodern. And that's going to be kind of huge. We're waiting to see how it breaks out, waiting to see what form it takes, waiting to see what narrative form it takes, and more particularly what visual arts do in the face of integral. So that's all right on the horizon, and that's why it's very exciting time in the art world, is we're watching the death of a huge movement and the birth of what will be a huge movement, and we're right on that cusp.
So, talking about the specific signifiers that are freshly being communicated by integral consciousness, I was in a discussion with my friend, the painter David Titterington, and he was telling me that Gene Gebser has a discussion of just that in one of his books. He's asking the question, is integral music structurally new music, or is it merely novel? And he gives 3 basic criteria for what integral music would attempt to do, which those criteria being to resolve in its own way the time problem temporically, to communicate this atemporal, post-temporal reality in a temporal way, then also to escape dualism and to attain an irrational mode of expression. And he said that the new music is in a position to abolish previous time forms. So do you agree with him on that?
Well, not exactly. What Gebser was doing was brilliantly tracing large epochs of development and not really understanding that individual hold-ons go through necessary stages, whereas social hold-ons do not go through mandatory stages. And also understanding the difference between an individual hold-on that has a dominant monad and a social hold-on that has a dominant mode of discourse. So he analyzed the dominant modes of discourse in major epochs that human beings have developed through, right up to sort of the leading edge of the epoch that he was in when he was writing, which was rational. And he got those essentially right, although you can slice development in an infinite number of ways. The way he did it is captures very well large aspects of the worldviews of these epochs, and they were, of course, archaic, magic, mythic, rational, rational being the first of the mental, and then integral aperspectival. And his integral aperspectival is basically a mixture of green and teal and turquoise and non-dual states. And it's just because he didn't have a model that more clearly separated these different dimensions. And so he tended to get right on the edge of what art was doing in his time and then look at any of the art beyond that and think that was coming from the next structure, whereas a lot of the art beyond that was coming from states of consciousness, for example, and some from very high states, non-dual states. And so he mistakenly imported a radical overcoming of duality in the integral aperspectival structure, and then it doesn't overcome radical subject-object duality that's still present. It can do it in temporary states, in non-dual states. So I don't exactly agree with Gebsers' analysis of that. What I see art doing is overcoming the problem of pluralism and the problem of relativism and finding ways, starting narratively, but moving to visual arts and music, overcome the performative contradictions of pluralism. And those are really fundamental in that there are problems of self-reflexivity. And the problem of green art, of pluralistic art, is that it's actually self-deconstructing. It starts out and it deconstructs things in the world that need to be deconstructed. But because it does not have access to a universalizing capacity, all it has access to is orange universals, which are rigid and monolithic and systemic. And so green basically is in part a criticism of orange universals because it has a perspective on systems. It has a metasystemic view. And so it sees that different systems can arise in different cultures and that in many ways knowledge is socially constructed. But then it takes that way too far because it's the only tools it has. And so art starts out deconstructing things that need to be deconstructed. It deconstructs the rigid conventions of this world. It deconstructs rigid taboos on virtually anything, any taboo on sex or power or females, males, anything like that. But then it has no ultimate place to stand because the same principles that it uses to deconstruct everything else actually apply to itself as well. And so you get an entire tension in postmodern art. You get a self-loathing that is deep and pervasive and is only handled basically by irony. And ironic art is art that says this is not true. That's what irony is a statement that means the opposite of what it really says. So, irony is like, oh, nice tie. And that sort of attitude of, oh, nice tie, goes through all of art because the only place it could stand is in an ironic, self-denying, and ultimately self-loathing stance. It's a bad time to be an artist because it's essentially making conscious the self-loathing that it wishes the world to have for itself. A deconstructed world is a world that is self-loathing to the core. And that's the essential core message, a hidden performative contradictory message in postmodern art. And it's because it's the performative contradiction in green altitude itself. Green is the last major structure before a truly integral structure. And so green is two things. It's both trying to be integral, claims that it doesn't marginalize anything, claims that it doesn't exclude anything, except it marginalizes orange, it marginalizes amber, it marginalizes red. It doesn't like any of those. And all of those get attacked. So it says it's trying to be integral, but it doesn't reach it. It doesn't really make it. And so it's sort of a halfway step to integral. And as such, it fails on its own desires. And it knows preconsciously that it's failed to deliver the integral goods. And so it again slips into self-loathing. So I don't think that the new art is primarily concerned with the temporal problem, and I don't think it's concerned with the duality problem. I think those are things that Gebser just picked out of the air, and I don't think it's irrational. The integral aperspectival is irrational. It's aperspectival. And what you get with second tier is universal perspectival. You get, in other words, perspectives that hold up as good enough universals and show the common patterns that all cultures are following. And these common patterns are not given eternally by archetypes. They're given by a common history. So we can still have nothing but history, the claim of postmodernism. But history unfolds in certain common ways around the world. And therefore we have universals. And they're not pre-given universals, but they're historically evolved universals. And that's what second tier can spot. And artists, as well as writers, that are in that space have an entirely different relation to art. Art goes from self-loathing to self-appreciative and self-satisfying and coming out of a self-abundance. It's one of the first art forms that moves from deficiency needs, which classify all first-tier signifiers, to being needs or superabundant needs or overflowing motivation. And that infects art as well. Art becomes celebratory, not necessarily in an exuberant way, but meaning in a non-self-contradictory way. Art can actually make statements without meaning them ironically. In other words, art can stop lying. And that's a fundamental change in the artist as well, because the artist becomes solid and can speak in one voice, can speak with one mind, with one heart, and feel it, and not feel that, oh, I'm just kidding, nice tie. Whereas a postmodern artist, because of the nature of the pluralistic structure, kind of rings like a cracked bell. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of preparatory work. The artist of the postmodern era is basically the artist that comes to reduce everything to equal fragments, including itself, in preparation for all of those fragments being integrated. Mm-hmm. And that's what art in the coming years can do, is get into art that doesn't solve the temporal problem or the duality problem, but solves the plurality problem, the self-loathing problem, and the lying, the fundamental lying that is at the heart of art in a postmodern era. And so again, that can be felt in the artist. The artist goes from feeling ringing like a cracked bell, because everything they criticize, they know at the bottom of their heart, the same criticism applies to their own artwork. And if everything else sucks, their own artwork sucks. It's just as well to be deconstructed. And so nothing has any fundamental meaning in postmodernism. And all you're supposed to do, all you can do, is put up stuff for ironic exposure and basically deconstruct anything that's out there. And that's all postmodern art can do. It cannot offer a positive vision. And so we're coming to the end of that era. And it's a preparatory era. It's sort of John the Baptist, basically. And that's why, again, it's very exciting to be in art at this time if you have teal or turquoise consciousness. I mean, I can sort of kind of go on about that theme, and let me sort of pause about that, because part of this is we were going to sort of have a discussion. And
well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, in this kind of context, then, when Gebser says that the new music is in a position to abolish previous time forms, he's actually speaking to the music of green deconstructionism.
He's speaking, yes, of that.
Digestive layer.
Yes, he's confusing it with that, and he also, in some of the positive aspects of that, he means a non-dual state, because that does abolish time.
Yeah. And then just kind of moving from that point at which, we're starting to kind of reassemble things and bring a tender appreciation of the partiality of our perspectives.
Right.
And, a recognition of deeper universals.
Right.
How do you see, and Let's stay on this topic for just one more question, because time is so fundamental to musical expression. As you described in your work, each altitude of development is aware of and expresses artistically a new mode of temporal experience. I've been really fascinated by the work of Arvo Pärt recently, and he describes his music as an expression of the wing beat of time, which is this tension between the linear time of rational awareness and this timeless space that we seem to start to put into when we recognize that the time that we experience from any perspective is a constructed notion. And I'm a little wary to say this, but it's almost like time as the spatial matrix.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, given that you have spoken with so many integral musicians and have explored the notion of time as it emerges in this integral vision logic awareness, how do you see that being experienced and communicated in integral music?
Well, I certainly agree with the gentleman that you quoted about, music certainly can be two-winged, one floating on timelessness and one floating on whatever the constructed nature of time is at any given level. And I think that is where we actually start to talk about sort of the two different dimensions of what art can do. And one is, again, it's structural, it's altitude. What actually is the altitude resonating in the signifier of the artwork? And that means that if you do music primarily from a red altitude, then in ways we don't fully understand, red signifiers will be transmitted along some sort of conducive medium and be picked up in another sentient being. If the other sentient being has the same essential bodily structure as you do, then that sentient being will resonate with the same altitude. They'll resonate with red if it has emerged in their own case. So in part, then, there's a vertical kind of judgment about what art is doing. And that is that it is coming from a particular altitude. If it's an altitude that is lower than the present center of gravity of the culture they're in, then it can be because it's trying to remind us of something that we've forgotten, or it can be pre-conventional adolescence rebelling against the conventional world and, fight the system and all the sort of protest music that is actually pre-conventional and protesting the imposition of a amber conventional structure on top of their red impulsive desires and intentionalities. If it's higher than the average center of gravity, then it's the call of the future. It's art from tomorrow. It's art on a signifier that the general culture is not yet embodying, and therefore it actually carries content and a transformative pull to these higher structures. And so it was as the Renaissance was emerging, for example, you would see visual painting go from grand mythic schemes with actual men as heroic and as semi-divine and a sort of very powerful mythic background to a painting that was reflective and coming from an orange, rational, perspectival space. So all of a sudden you get three-dimensional perspective for the first time, which is astonishing, that actually people don't see three dimensions until they get to orange rational structure. And it didn't get depicted in art until that time. And so standing even in visual art with three dimensions was a transformative pull on consciousness. It's actually art as transformation, art as cultural transformation. And then often what was depicted in some of those spaces was just an individual person, just portraiture. And because individual egos are the nature of orange society, as opposed to mythic roles and rule roles in the mythic society. And so just looking at this artwork would have the effect of taking somebody at amber and pulling them up to orange. And the same thing happened as postmodern revolution hit art, and you had Marcel Duchamp's urinal just put out there and presented as a piece of art. That artwork was, is still consistently, I saw another voting where it was voted the most important artwork of the 20th century. And it's because of just what it did that it announced there's an entirely different form of art. It's an art that is self-exposing and self-deconstructing of the present society. And that self-deconstruction became a transformative pull for people at orange to move into green. And, of course, there's all the problems of green and all the self-contradictions in it. Nonetheless, it's a higher altitude. And so art can perform that transformative function. But then art can also, and that's sort of a vertical function, if you will, but art can also perform kind of think of it as a horizontal function of states. And there it's not so much transformative, it is transmuting. And that means that at whatever altitude you're at, art can evoke these states. And beyond just sort of subtle emotional states, which good art tends to do in any event, there is what we could call really sort of spiritual art. And spiritual art, no matter what its content, pulls people into causal, witnessing contemplative states, or into non-dual flow states. And that actually moves them from a third person to a second person to a first person. So art starts out as a third person, as just something that you listen to as an object. But then if it really has impact on you, people will start to say, no, I really hear that music, or the art is speaking to me. And that sort of moves it because it's moved into a second-person relationship with that artifact. And then if that sort of deep connection continues, the person will move into a first-person identification in a non-dual flow state with that artwork. And so that is a transmuting and a liberating force of art. So the first one is more a transformative and a communicating and a working with fullness. And the second one is working with freedom, is working with actually helping you to, in a sense, disidentify with any particular manifest thing and simply move into a role of witness and contemplation, or then non-dual unification. And so these are sort of two different dimensions that art is working on. And the second dimension of transmuting into causal or non-dual spaces, that's indeed working with the timeless. That's working with a real eternity. That's working with an actual abyss, the actual vast openness or presence or emptiness from which each thing emerges moment to moment. And ultimately, we are that vast openness. That is our own big mind. The witness in each of us right now that's listening to these words and sees an environment around it, is aware of thoughts moving through its mind, is aware of sensations. The witness of all of those is pure spirit. And art can evoke that realization as a peak experience. And at that point, and that's a very real emptiness. That's a pure, absolute, ultimate spirit. And art is one of the forms that immediately can tap into that dimension and can find ways to transmit it. And that is indeed one of the important functions of art. So the first is to sort of transmit a certain sort of altitude, a certain space, a certain signified perspective. But the other is to actually tap into a spiritual dimension, an absolute dimension, a dimension that's eternal and that's timeless, and can influence the art simply by going through the mind of the artist on its way to the artwork. And the artifact will pick up as much eternity as the artist can, get into it. But being influenced by both of those, so the artist dipping into their own sources of creativity, their own vast open wellspring of creativity, which is itself pure causal spirit. And then out of that comes creative forms. And artists are more attuned generally speaking, to the emergence of these creative forms. And that's part of what art is all about, is transmitting those forms that are closest to the timeless and closest to eternity. And sort of go back and forth between the world of form and the formless, the world of form and the formless, as the source of creativity, and then that which is created. And then that gets transmitted depending on the talent of the artist.
And in this light where art can be kind of more of a transformative or a transmutive technology, the integral artist, the integral painter or musician or sculptor or author or whatever,
right, is
operating with an immediate awareness of this deeper union beneath the multiplicity. And so is there even, in attempting to communicate anything about the relative world, anything within this timelessness, is there such a thing as a coherent spatial or temporal message that comes from an integral art, something that we can recognize as a transformative signifier from that altitude? Or is it that the integral artist is so fascinated with and attentive to this honoring of this entire continuum that there is no one single perspective that we're going to be able to recognize as emergent at that level?
Well, I think it's a good question, and I think, though, that there is a signifier, and I don't know that I would call it a single signifier, but I would call it maybe a common class of signifiers. Mm-hmm. And they're signifiers that basically look, touch, and feel vision logic. And basically what that means is a systemic, but a genuinely systemic, acceptance of everything that's arising. And so even though some of the things that are arising can be portrayed in integral art, let's say a red music beat could be included primarily in a piece of turquoise art, let's say, but it's going to be red as it appears in a turquoise space. It's not going to be red as it appears in a red space. So red as it appears in a red space is an impulsive set of signifiers that cannot take the role of other. It simply is in a narcissistic space, and it is in an egocentric, power-driven space. And it has no option but to do that, and it can't even take the role of other. It doesn't even know how you are resonating to this, except as an extension of itself. And that's entirely, it's half different from how red appears if presented in a turquoise piece of art. Even if it's presented alone in a turquoise piece of art, it's presented without the first-person perspective limitation. So, in other words, it's just pure power or pure intentionality held in its own right, not taken over by a first-person perspective. So it's just sheer power, but power that is actually held in a turquoise space. It's sheer intentionality, but intentionality held in a turquoise space. So that means at the very least it's red power looked at in a fifth-person perspective. And even though the essential contours of power might look the same, there's going to be a flavor to it. There's going to be an atmosphere to it. There's going to be some sort of turquoise signifier. And again, I don't think there's a single one. I think there's a whole class of common turquoise signifiers that red is going to be held in. And exactly how that works, nobody knows. Nobody knows how vibrations of consciousness or how levels of consciousness or how stages of consciousness, nobody knows how consciousness itself gets imprinted in signifiers. But the integral theory is that not only does consciousness inform material artifacts, but the viewer of those artifacts has the same resonance drawn forth in their own being. And so, and there might even be subtle energies involved in this. And that's actually part of how there's a genuine concrete transmission. Or it just might be that birds of a feather flock together. But whatever it is, a turquoise signifier, a turquoise space, is recognizable in the whole feeling of complex coherence that it communicates. And even if it's communicating something narrow, it will be communicating in a space of complex coherence. And that will have a feeling to postmodern pluralism as something that is really healing a lot of fractures that postmodernism either induced or exposed. There'll be an actual feeling to second tier in the same way that there's a distinct feeling to orange, three perspectives. And what we're waiting to see is what the actual structure of those signifiers are. Because we can look at them in certain individuals, but turquoise is still being laid down. And there's still any number of actual ways that it could be laid down. But right now, the general signifiers are basically complex coherence and a differentiated and integrated consciousness. And that gets transferred to the artwork and is there to be decoded from the artwork.
Yeah. Something that just off the top of my head when I saw Tool last April, they're working with such, you talk about like the red beat, this driving primal aggressive energy,
right.
And yet it was clear from my place in the audience that they were holding it with such even-handedness, and that they were allowing the audience to move through these spaces and to kind of grapple with this material with the spaciousness that they themselves were holding for the music.
Yeah, there you go.
So that seems to be, I mean, that's pretty much what you're getting at, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good explanation. It's a good description of it, too.
So, part of this, you mentioned, part of it is a process of differentiation, part of it's a process of integration.
Right.
And that we don't really understand how we charge a work of art with our intent. Suffice to say that there does seem to be a certain balance between being able to hold it in a third-person place and to take a perspective on it, but also an ability to enter into it and to, as the artist, live as the work in its construction.
Right.
Paul Levy talks a lot about the work being, in some sense, a projected component of this higher self that's attempting to emerge through you. So what do you see as being common traits among artists who are talented at specifically and consciously communicating a particular vision, or state, or mode of consciousness? Even if we don't know the actual mechanism for this process, as engineers of states of consciousness, what do you see people continuing to find to be useful in their art?
Yeah, and this gets into areas of just how, just where artists themselves come from. Are they born? Are they made? Is it reincarnation? Is it a rebirth? Help explain why somebody like Mozart hits the ground running, because it's certainly hard to explain with normal developmental scales what some of these individuals are doing. But in terms of just what basically constitutes the artist is certainly certain skills in certain of the multiple intelligences, because there are different kinds of art. There's no single psychograph of, let's say, a second-tier artist, except there is a capacity, at least intermittently, for second-tier cognition, because that is indeed what's going to be the essential stamping signifier of the artwork, that fourth or fifth person perspective that gives the feeling, the deep feeling of connectedness and the deep feeling of complex coherence and the deep feeling of a truly, not the way Gebser meant it, but a truly integral perspectival, a truly integral space bringing together any number of different perspectives and showing the common central feeling to all of those perspectives, the integral universals, and not just the monolithic orange formal operational universals. And so that cognitive line is going to be the stamp that is certainly one of the foremost things that gets added into the medium and informs the actual structure and the pattern, the flow, and the nature of second-tier art. And then there's excellence in and achievement in other multiple intelligences depending on the nature of art itself. So certain kinds of art will have an excellence in kinesthetic intelligence. Others will have an excellence in affective intelligence. Others will display an excellence in intrapersonal intelligence. And you can sort of go through almost any of the multiple intelligences and find some type of art that makes use of them. And so that sort of gets across the whole point about what is art and why do we do art and what's the actual nature of art itself. And sort of put that aside for a moment to sort of finish touching this other question. I'll just say that art is the depiction of that which is pleasing and attractive or beautiful. And we can come back to that, but human beings, that's an inherent nature of human beings. That's one of the dimensions of human beings, one of the quadrants, in a sense. And so all human beings are artists to some degree, but then some individuals will take that capacity and refine it into really extraordinary pieces of self-expressive and communicative artwork, and using almost any number of multiple intelligences. So one of the things that an integral artist is doing, of course, is firing up second-tier cognition. And that means anything that the artist can do to help take the perspective of others and take the perspective of others and take perspectives on perspectives on perspectives. Because even though those sound really kind of abstract and difficult, they're actually straightforward and simple and profound ways that individuals get a view of how other people are viewing what other people are viewing. But this just comes up, and it's one of the ways that worldviews are integrated, and that second tier automatically integrates the worldview of red and the worldview of amber and the worldview of orange and the worldview of green. And just even having a sense of that wholeness comes from one of those higher perspectives. So any sort of practice of perspective taking, any just putting oneself in the shoes of others and being able to see not only through one's perspective but through others is a fundamental nature of integral cognition. And then in terms of the states issues, this is where sort of emotional issues of artists get drawn in, because often emotional disorders involve states of consciousness, and many artists have taken advantage of that. And of course there's the whole notion of there's a fine line between genius and madness, and that line in this case is referring to access to states of consciousness and the ease with which some artists do it. I mean, there's to any number of these states. But one's capacity to experience states in a wakeful fashion is an extremely important part of inculcating artistic capacity, and particularly to the transmutation capacity of art. And that's into subtle dimensions and into causal dimensions and into non-dual. And one of the best ways to do that, of course, is meditation and contemplation. And then one can do that, though, with any particular aim in mind. One doesn't have to do this change of states with a spiritual nature in mind, although, in a sense, they are spiritual. They don't have necessarily content that is religious. So basically anything that helps open states of consciousness to artists is something that's really fundamental in terms of their own development and their own program of excellence, basically. And I think really great art, what it does is it reaches an extraordinary balance between the sort of transformative art and transmutation art. And that's sort of the two wings that I think terrific art rests on. And so those are two sort of dimensions that artists want to pay attention to. And many of them are born doing this, but a lot of that can be trained.
So, as a musician who wants to communicate a message of love to the world, basically I have to get two things straight, which would be that I have to be a skilled communicator, and I need to develop myself in whatever ways are relevant to the medium in which I'm attempting to express that message. Mm-hmm. But then the other is that I actually have to be in love. For it to be a totally authentic message, I actually have to be in a loving state of mind when I'm engaging my work. And there's something that I've seen so much of just living up here in Boulder, and there's so much conscious media. There's like a node of truly conscious media, and then around it there's this vast morass of media that seems to be following the style but not the substance.
Right.
Alex Gray really railed on modern advertisement in his book, The Mission of Art, for painting a glowing aura around a hamburger and whoring out the spiritual stuff.
And yes, there's a lot of that in Boulder around so-called integral.
But there's actually a transformative demand that you're saying here that's being made on the artist in order to successfully communicate their, whatever, the muse.
Right.
There's actually a kind of a multivalent practice involved that is a practice of mind and a practice of body that's involved in being a good artist.
Yes, and the key thing to what you're saying is that whatever state of consciousness an artist is in, whether they're conscious of it or not, is going to be what informs and impacts the artifact. And that is what will be, that's what is available. That's the impression that it will have on viewers or readers or listeners of the art. And that's a really crucial item in integral theory, is that these artifacts are created by sentient beings, and sentient beings impact those artifacts with essentially the nature of consciousness that is doing the creating. And that artifact will then evoke a similar state of consciousness in sentient beings viewing or impacting it or coming into contact with it. And so that means that exactly you can have artwork about love from somebody who is genuinely in love or is genuinely conveying feelings they had when they were truly in love. That's still alive for them. That will, like it or not, impact the artifact. And likewise, this sort of adulterous, fake advertising stuff, when a false consciousness creates a piece of art, dimensions of what is communicated in that art will include the false nature, will include the tinniness, will include the inauthenticness of it. And a good critic will be able to spot that. And, of course, to be a good critic, you have to be integrally alive to all of these dimensions yourself. Somebody who's green cannot be an informed critic of turquoise art. And all they'll see is how much of those signifiers can get in to their altitude, which is very limited. But that's a really important point, is that whatever you wish to convey in art is something that you genuinely have to be in a state of yourself, or have immediate access to it, or certainly a good, genuine recollection of it. And that is what will be conveyed. And you can't really choose some of these factors. And that's what's kind of an important point, is that you can't really choose the altitude that you're in. You can choose to sort of convey the highest that you're possible of, and you can get in the highest states that you are possible of. But that might be, for example, green, or it might be orange, or it might be turquoise. But whatever that altitude is the altitude that will come across in the artwork. And that's why we can look at artwork, we can sort of read something, certainly reading something, and you just get the feeling that, oh, this person is very, very amber, or this person is very, turquoise, this person is very green. It comes across as a smell, a touch, a feel. It's the actual signifiers are embedded in that space, in the artifact. And so leading edge artists are ones that just almost usually even unknowingly, but they do find themselves at a leading edge of transformation. And so their signifiers are coming down a level or two above where the cultural center of gravity is, and is speaking to people in a way that then is actually transformative. And as a secondary issue, it might also, the impact of that transformative art might be doubly increased by having transmutational elements in it as well. And then it comes across as something that carries an extremely timeless, important message. And so both of those dimensions are ones, though, that cannot be faked, because your consciousness can fake what you're saying. You can put the glow around the hamburger, but what comes across in the artifact doesn't lie. The artifact tells the truth. And whatever you actually make is the product of the entire being of the maker. And if there's something in there that's false or crooked or wrong, it will come out. And we all know artists that are, that sort of famously have particular kinds of shadows that just show up in everything. And that's just one example. But the artwork doesn't lie. The artist might lie, but the artwork doesn't lie.
Yeah. That's an excellent place to jump from that. Earlier on, just a few minutes ago, you mentioned why we do art, because it's an attempt to express or to communicate something beautiful. And, I make the expression, communication thing, the distinction here, because in any case, it's moving into the signifier and then back into someone's first-person awareness. And it may be that it's private art, and it may be that you're only making it for yourself.
Right.
But at the same time, it's still, in some sense, a communication from yourself in one moment to yourself in another moment.
Right.
From one perspective to another perspective.
Right.
So, yeah, basically at this point, I would kind of like to, with that anchor, kind of flip this conversation a little bit, because we've spent a lot of time analyzing the nature of artwork, and rather than systematizing it in a scientific survey or exploration, I'd like to just ask for you to discuss why we do art, why we do music, how we experience music, this cluster of concepts from more of a poetic place. I know that you write extensively in both an analytical voice and also as more of a spiritual poet.
Right.
So if we can just step back from integral theory as a heuristic device for a minute, and then if I can hear you talk about these things as an artist, why do we do artwork?
Right.
Why do we make music?
Right. The fundamental answer to that is that it's an essential need of human beings, and it expresses something that, if we're going to talk specifically about an aesthetic view, then we're talking about that judgment that humans make about what is attractive to them, about what's beautiful. And that's essentially something that, even postmodern art, which certainly sometimes doesn't look beautiful, is nonetheless expressing what postmodernists find attractive. And it's that feeling of what's attractive, it's the feeling of what's beautiful, and both the sort of self-feeling of that and the desire to communicate that. So although all art isn't necessarily this type of communication, most art does have a component that is this, and it's a central part of it. And it is indeed the communication of that which you feel is really beautiful about life. And in my own case, what I find really beautiful is both informed by a sort of a second and third tier vision, logic and vision, and a causal and non-dual state. Because both of those point to that which is beautiful as a vast wholeness, a harmony, a balance, a universe where no matter how things appear on the surface, underneath them they're beautiful. And everything that's arising is exquisitely beautiful. Everything that's arising is a ornament of spirit, is a absolute positive manifestation of the ultimate divine. And whether it shows up in first persons or second persons or third persons, it's showing up as this exquisite, painful beauty. And that beauty can be expressed at any altitude, and so you can express it in first-tier terms, you can express it with second-tier terms, you can express it with third-tier terms. It is, in terms of my own writing, because I have selected to write in certain academic circles, then the form of my writing is often constrained by what's accepted in those circles. And that's a kind of a third-person, analytic, sort of rational, cognitive sort of overview. So even if I'm writing about things that are trans-rational, I'm giving a rational summary of them. But my work never confuses the two. I'm, more than anybody, point out that this is just a map. We don't confuse it with a territory. And all of my books have a call for praxis or practice. And even going back to the first books I wrote, like No Boundary, each chapter is a theoretical discussion about a particular level of consciousness. And then at the end of that chapter, each chapter has dozens of practices that you can do to evoke that level. So it's grounded in a praxis that wants to really evoke for everybody this universe of beauty and this universe of radiance and this universe of a splendid ornamentation of the one and only divine. And that is most immediately expressed in artistic mode, because artistic mode is one of the sort of, well, it's just the way that I speak, and it's the way that most human beings celebrate something that they find wonderful and that they want to share with somebody else. And they want to help take that I space of beauty and wonderfulness and make a we space out of it, expand it to as many people as possible, and make that communication to as many people as possible. And so one of the ways that I do it in my own writing is after I've written, hundreds of pages of technical stuff, then I'll sort of slip into poetic descriptions and poetic celebrations and more artistic modes of celebrating this profound, great perfection. Entire books have been written by just taking those parts out. The Simple Feeling of Being, for example, is an entire book of just the poetic statements. So, definitely there's a place for that, and it's a primary place in terms of my own expression of my own understanding. But again, it gets curbed where I have to write technical and theoretical, analytical writings, and so I play by those rules. But even then, I usually try to sneak in a little bit of poetry because that is a more intimately first-person mode of expression and less a sort of a third-person, dry, analytic mode. And it's certainly not true that I, have some sort of addiction to the cognitive line or anything like that. It's just when in Rome,
No more than I do.
Yeah. So those are a few of the reflections in terms of what I do as an artist.
Yeah. So then that's what Ken Wilber does as an artist. And then what I'm picking up from this whole scope is that from a witnessing or a non-dual vantage, that because everything is arising as this beautiful and luminous integrated wholeness, that there is, in some sense, a movement or an effluence from spirit in which the entire work of the universe is a single artistic act.
Yeah.
Right? And so if you could just expound a little bit on that, about the motivation of spirit to create this conversation as a work of art.
Right. And that's fundamentally comes out of the superabundance of spirit itself and what it would be able to do as ultimate absolute spirit. And there have been lots of theoretical arguments about this. I mean, going back to Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle argues that the ultimate one, because it's complete in itself, has nothing to do with manifestation. It wouldn't create anything because that would imply a lack. Plato, on the other hand, says, well, wait a minute, a spirit that can't create is less full than a spirit that can. And so for Plato, there are shadows in the cave, but they're shadows of the light. And once you discover the light, you're supposed to embrace the shadows. But actually, Plato is even though he's branded as a dualist, he really ultimately was a non-dualist and saw ascending and descending as one essential process. But that's certainly my point of view, is it's a superabundance of spirit and the superabundance of I amness that causes it, and cause is not quite the right word, but just is why, also not quite the right word, why it overflows. Again, because there's no causality here. There's not something in time that pushes spirit to do something over here. It's a radical, timeless superabundance. Once manifestation is created, then you can talk about time. And then there's temporal unfolding. But all of these things are modifications of spirit itself. And spirit itself remains, you can poetically describe it as vast and full and omnipotent and infinite and eternal and so on. But those are all metaphors. And the absolute itself is the best it can be described as just pure emptiness, unqualified, including that. But metaphors then help to talk about it, and that's where we talk about the superabundance of the one. And that superabundance just causes an overflowing into the world, and it's in a sharing capacity, but it also then creates different viewpoints out of itself. It's like if you want to play checkers with yourself kids do this all the time, and they are first learning checkers, and they want to play it with themselves. And they play one side, and they try to play the other side, but they realize it doesn't work because they know what the other side's going to do. And so it sort of dawns on you that the only way you can actually have a real game is if you take different perspectives and forget that you're taking the other perspective, or you won't get a real game going. And so out of this superabundance, in order to get a real game going, Spirit creates all these different perspectives and then forgets who it is. And there is a slow evolving back to a remembering of that. Again, sort of metaphorically putting it that way. But individual perspectives can wake up at any time to their fundamental oneness with this absolute pure I amness. And that is a union of the human and the divine, and an intersection of the eternal, timeless, and the world of time. All of which, though, is nonetheless a product of the superabundance of this divine mystery. And that's part of what my own writing is tracking and attempting to give some coherent expression to, although it again remains, they're just inscriptions on the face of stuff that's gone with the wind, and are good stories for this time because I think they stick, but they're just stories and just ways of tracking what this superabundance is all about. And I generally write it at a turquoise indigo level of communication, just because that's about the highest you can go at and still have a fair number of people that will understand what you're saying.
If you've got really good news, you see something really beautiful, you got nobody to share it with. From a mythological perspective, you can say it's like, well, you got nobody to share it with, you got to make somebody.
Right. Basically, that's exactly right. Yeah. It's no fun having dinner alone. You can't really get into things like sharing, and you can't really get into things like love, in terms of loving of another. And so for all these reasons, lots of other sort of metaphoric reasons, makes it easy to understand why, even if you were perfect, absolute, infinite one, if you wanted to just, again, even have a game, or just have something that was going to surprise you, if you wanted to actually have an adventure, then you could dream something, but in order for that dream to really work, you'd have to forget during the dream that you're the one doing it, because otherwise it just doesn't work. So all of these different ways that Spirit starts the world, and the different accounts of them, all have some notion of amnesia or forgetting, and all have, in terms of the path of realization, some notion of anamnesis or remembrance or recognition of something that's already true and not something that has to be created. And that's why the supreme realization itself is just a recognition of ever-present big mind, a recognition of ever-present true self, and not something that has to be created or developed. But in the world itself that's manifest, that world in this particular go-round relates by evolving. And evolution is the one central notion of the manifest universe. And so we track spirits unfolding in the manifest universe, which is the universe of itself, and we track that through development and evolution. And that's just sort of one of the stories that sticks best in this particular manifest world. But you can see how all of these stories about manifestation have to do with forgetting who you are in order to get a good game started.
Every work of art has multiple interpretations. So even here in the mundane, vividly, there's this process by which the artist is, in attempting to communicate a single message, actually creating this multiplicity of perspectives constantly.
Right. Yeah. And the more evolved the artist is, the deeper the implicit number of perspectives it will accept. And therefore, there's just a depth to the artwork that is noticeable. There's a presence in the artwork that's noticeable. And that depth is just almost palpable. You can just sort of feel it. And the more developed the person is, the more depth they have. And the more it becomes something that you just actually can feel it in their presence.
All those other interpretations right on the other side of perception.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much, Ken.
Oh, well, sure.
It's a lovely opportunity, and I think I speak on behalf of a lot of people, all my friends who helped me formulate some of these questions, and the Zod's Visionary Music community, the integral community at large, when I say, thank you for your time today. And,
Great. Thank you, Michael. This was fun.